WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange's extraordinary legal journey has now ended in a court in the remote ocean island archipelago called the Northern Mariana Islands. Assange pleaded guilty in a court in Saipan, the capital of the U.S. territory, before flying home to Australia. He faced charges for conspiracy to publish military documents on the WikiLeaks website. The U.S. has almost 100 district courts, but the one in Saipan is the country's smallest. Why was the hearing held there, and what are the implications of this 14-year-old legal battle on investigative journalism? Let's find out more with a member of the Johannesburg Bar, Advocate Kevin Hopkins. Advocate Hopkins, good morning. Thank you very much for your time. We'll go through this piece by piece, but Assange's epic legal battle ends in such an obscure location. The Northern Mariana Islands, have been sharing with our viewers, is just a part of a string of tiny dots in the Pacific Ocean. Why did it end here in this remote court?
Yeah, good morning, Iman. I think the reason for that is that an American court had to have jurisdiction over him because ultimately it ended off with a settlement. So there was a plea deal. As you mentioned in your introduction, he's pleaded guilty to one of the 13 charges, and it has to be confirmed in a court, and that court would have to be an American court. And I think there might be two reasons why he didn't go to mainland America, for example, to New York. And I think the first is possibly out of mistrust. He wouldn't want to land on American mainland soil, perhaps fearing for his safety. And the second reason, I think, is that he was on his way home. And the Mariana Islands are very close to the coast of Australia and the Pacific Ocean. So he's almost there, as it turns out.
It's so interesting that all of this, and we have been so enveloped in the saga, the story, and the experience of Julian Assange over these many years, that in a sense, for it to end in the way that it has, and with the plea deal, we'll talk more about what happened inside court in terms of that guilty plea. How would this all have come about, and what background can you share in a case like this, so high profile, having taken so many years to craft out a deal that eventually sees him go home?
Yeah, so Iman, the history for the viewers who perhaps don't know it is that Julian Assange started WikiLeaks back in 2006. I think at that time he was about 35 years old. Prior to that, he was a fairly sort of amateur hacker himself. And then later on called himself an ethical hacker in the sense that he thought that if what he did was expose high-powered people to corruption or to criminality, then he might be able to persuade them to steer away from that kind of conduct because they would be scared of getting exposed. And it's that philosophy that I think started WikiLeaks. And in the beginning, it really became I suppose, a platform for whistleblowers to tell their stories and for them and for wrongdoers to be exposed that way. But things changed, I think, in 2010 with Chelsea Manning's leaks. You may remember that 3 troves of official documents were leaked by her in 2010. And the one that got the world's attention was called Collateral Murder. And that's the scene of the Apache helicopter in Baghdad, which fired upon 18 civilians just walking along the street, minding their own business. And 2 Reuters journalists were killed, I think, during that particular attack. And that was probably seen as an assault on journalism itself. But more importantly, it was a publishing house exposing criminality on the part of the American government and, more importantly, war crimes. And, of course, that got the back of the Americans up. And after that, WikiLeaks gained in prominence. And Chelsea Manning, who was working at the time, she was a military intelligence analyst, managed to then hack her own employer's computer system in order to get more information, which she then fed to Julian Assange. And that's the stuff that made itself available on the WikiLeaks platform. So your question really is, how does it end up in such an obscure place? Well, it took a lot of twists and turns because after the publication of all of that material, and the material was very incriminating, Iman. For example, there was a whole catalogue, about 390,000 files that Chelsea Manning sent to Julian Assange, which dealt with what America was really getting up to in Iraq, and the fact that what the American diplomatic voices had been telling the world that they were doing in Iraq might not have been what they really wanted to do, and there was exposure also to various hit squads and death squads of people that would go out and assassinate journalists. And there was a terrible embarrassment, of course, for the American government. And they did everything, just about everything that they could to try and get Julian Assange back into America for him to be prosecuted. And that's really what put into process the saga that you were talking about, which started really in 2012 and only ended yesterday.
It gave us, as you were explaining, the details around some of those cables. And just for our viewers, again, there's a lot of really great material that synthesizes the benefit of some of the work that WikiLeaks and through Julian Assange's initiative has done in providing some of the texture around some of these inside deals, embarrassing details of how U.S. diplomats perceive some of their foreign counterparts, for example, or conversations between some of these global players, or even the disparity between the public-facing, politics and statements made by political officials versus what they might have thought in private, that you've also just shared with us right now. It all circles back to the work of investigative journalism. As you mentioned, in 2006, the WikiLeaks website was launched. It was a platform that allowed people to anonymously submit their secret classified documents and videos. And after the publication of those leaks, for example, in 2009, things like the Minton report, which exposed how an internal report commissioned by the Singapore headquartered multinational company Trafigura concluded that its dumping of hundreds of thousands of liters of toxic waste, including harmful chemicals in the Ivory Coast, led to severe damage to the communities there. Not only that, you talked about, the Syria cables, the Afghanistan cables, the Iraqi cables, just the absolute breadth of the information that is now in the public domain wouldn't have been there had he not made this professional decision but personal sacrifice. How do you see this playing out in terms of organizations and institutions continuing to be able to do the invaluable work of investigative journalism?
So, Iman, two things, I think. The very first is that had Julian Assange's trial gone ahead and had he been prosecuted and then convicted in an American court, it would have had a chilling effect on investigative journalism. That's the first point. So it's a good thing that it didn't end up going to a court, and it's a good thing that there isn't a precedent set. But the second thing is that the critics of Julian Assange say that he wasn't really a journalist. All that he was a publishing platform for whistleblowers to come and dump information. But I think a lot of the criticism has been debunked. For example, when all of those WikiLeaks cables and logs were sent by Chelsea Manning to Julian Assange, I think the first thing that he did was get 5 very reputable newspaper companies involved. So, for example, The Guardian from the UK and Le Monde from Paris, and he got an American one involved. And a whole bunch of journalists from reputable media companies helped him to sift through all of these cables. And it wasn't just a case of receiving them and dumping them onto a platform. They were carefully edited. Editorial comment was given on them, and in places sensitive information and names were redacted. So all of that tends to suggest that it was not just a platform, but there was some proper investigative journalism work that was done. And without that, quite frankly, governments wouldn't be exposed. So America said in its extradition case that Assange had threatened the safety and security of Americans. But perhaps not. But what he had done was he exposed the threat that America had posed to the rest of the world in order to hold America accountable. And I think that's quite important because that's what investigative journalists do all the time. We see it now. We see, for example, investigative journalists telling us what's going on in Gaza in order to hold the IDF accountable, or people telling us about the atrocities that the Russians are committing in the Ukraine. None of that would be possible if it wasn't for brave journalists to come forward and expose it. And thank goodness. The world held its breath, I think. You being an investigative journalist yourself would have realized the threat to your profession that America's extradition case was posing.
You used two words there, Kevin. The one is brave and the other is exposed. There is some exposure, though, and we've seen with other colleagues around the world where, the ultimate price is paid insofar as being killed or taken out by governments who don't want certain information to be exposed or wants to shut down a critical voice. In this instance, of course, Julian Assange has been on the run for many years and then spending 5 years in a British jail. He did accept that it was his actions were a violation now of the U.S. Espionage Act, and he was hoping, I think, initially that he would be protected by U.S. First Amendment laws. It didn't quite pan out that way. So there's a cautionary tale here. How do you interpret the fact that now, ultimately he did plead guilty and had to plead guilty, whether that was, gun to head. And there was quite some description about his demeanor in that court when he was making his plea as well, that kind of provides some clues as to his state of mind and state of being. But what do you do in a context where, this case is showing that in some cases you might not be insulated by the law?
Yes. Accepting a plea deal isn't always an admission. Well, legally, it's, of course, an admission of guilt. But I think he made the point when he appeared in the Mariana Islands that he did so reluctantly. And the First Amendment provisions that you raised, so that's the freedom of expression and freedom of the press provisions in the American Constitution, would have been usefully tested in a case like this. But I think in the American judicial system, constitutional rights like that First Amendment right are only available to American citizens. In other words, they offer citizens protection against an abuse of power by their own government. But Assange, of course, is an Australian, not an American. And the fear was that he wouldn't enjoy those First Amendment protections. So any defense that an ordinary American journalist might have had would have been substantially weakened. And I think he recognized that there were difficulties with the case. And quite frankly, having spent 12 years, as you say, sort of on the run, 7 of them in an Ecuadorian embassy and 5 of them in Belmarsh, I think it was time to go home. I think he was just exhausted. He looks exhausted when you see the footage of him.
Yeah, and his wife speaking quite impassionately about, their young children as well, and the opportunity that this creates for them to be reunited. Advocate Kevin Hopkins, I wish we had more time to talk, but thank you very much for your analysis and your insight. We appreciate it very much.